politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. Let me just mention this first hour here, we're going to get into this Gallup poll that a lot of people are talking about, and that is the fact that you now have a majority of Democrats who actually believe that socialism is preferable to capitalism. First time that has been done, and I'll go into some of the numbers and details in just a minute. And it really relates to my commentary today, which I wrote a week ago, but nevertheless landed perfectly on this day as we talk about this issue of socialism. My commentary is called A Battle Over Socialism. We'll get into that, and then we're going to look at some of the rulings that have come from the Ninth Circuit Court related to gun issues. And a little bit later, if we have some time, we'll get into some other things about everything from the NFL to some of the responses to the tax cuts that have actually made many people's lives better, even though they've been referred to by some leaders as mere crumbs. Next hour, Michael Youssef will be with us. We'll be talking about his book, Life-Changing Prayers, and what it really is. I don't know why, again, somebody didn't think about this just last week when we had Jarrett Stevens in here. Why didn't we ever think about doing a book that looked at all the various times in which God revealed himself on mountains? The mountains are calling. Well, this one, again, is one of those ones. Why didn't we think about this? These are the 7 kind of really dynamic prayers, primarily from the Old Testament. When we think about prayer, we think about Jesus praying, but these are really mostly Old Testament, but not exclusively. Eleazar, Hannah, David, Daniel, Jonah, Habakkuk, and others. Of course, Mary's in there as well. So, I mean, it's just a fascinating book that we'll be talking about with Michael Youssef. And I got a feeling he's probably got a few comments about this New Mexico compound that has at least had Muslims there that were training young people to actually go out and to shoot kids in the schools. So we'll get into those conversations as well. So we've got a lot to cover. And at any point, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. My commentary today, which is available on our website, pointofview.net, is entitled The Battle Over Socialism. And again, I wrote this a week ago, but it fits perfectly into what has landed because of this new Gallup poll. I said, we're kind of in the midst of a battle about socialism, and it isn't sort of an academic debate about socialism. It isn't even about a discussion about whether socialism worked or did not work in Venezuela or Cuba or someplace like that. But really, it's a battle that's beginning to surface right now in the midterms elections. Because as we've pointed out on this program, we've had some individuals that have been traveling around who are self-identified socialists. That would be Bernie Sanders in the United States Senate. And then one individual, but there's now going to be 2, most likely looking at this latest election, that are socialist in the House of Representatives, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and I'll mention another one just a little bit later, that are actually traveling around stumping for certain candidates, and in some cases, some of those socialist candidates actually are winning at least the Democratic primary, and in some places, if you win the Democratic primary, you'll win the general election, just like if you in some places where they're very red precincts, and you win a primary as a Republican, you'll win the general election as well. So we'll see what that is. But the point I'm making in my commentary was that there have been kind of some key talking points. One has been free college tuition, and the other has, of course, been Medicare for all. And I point out that that's not just a topic for just a few kind of outliers, a few obscure people, a few radical leftists, but that's becoming more and more mainstream. And we even had that conversation on Friday with Dr. Merrill Matthews as well as Lathan Watts, because we're seeing that this has become so much a part of what the various presidential candidates are going to be talking about in the next 2 years. that I'm pretty sure that will end up being one of the platforms in the Democratic platform. And so the point I'm making is that if you're in the midst of these midterms right now and people are raising some of these questions, you need to really be asking some good questions. Like, for example, do you really want government more involved in healthcare decisions than they are right now? If you've ever had difficulty trying to get the government to move on certain issues, you say, well, I really would like to have something other than the generic. And they say, well, yeah, but we just can't justify it in terms of cost. Or won't this particular procedure be covered? And they'll say, no, it's not covered. And you, of course, perhaps have run into that. And if you haven't run into it under Medicare, because you may not be that old, and you may not have run into it under VA because you may not be a veteran, you've at least heard some stories like that. And so the first question is, do you really want government, and basically, we get right down to it, a government bureaucrat, unelected, who you do not know, making a decision that affects your health care? Does that make you feel good about that? And that's the first issue. The second is, do we really want to force doctors to accept Medicare-level payments, which are about 20%, but according to Bernie Sanders would be perhaps even as much as 40% lower than what is paid by private insurers? Do you really think doctors and hospitals are going to go for that, or whether some of them are just going to say, I quit, and they walk off the situation, or the hospital simply says, we'll close it down. We just can't make any money doing that. But the biggest question, of course, is the one that we've talked about before, and that is the fact that if you look at some of the studies, the Mercatus study, probably the best known, $32.6 trillion, or a little over $32 trillion, almost $33 trillion over the next 10 years, at a time when our national debt is about $20 trillion. You can see we're talking about numbers, or that the federal government is projected during that same period of time to spend about $56 trillion. You start seeing, can we really afford that much additional expense? And, of course, the answer to that is no. But the bottom line is most people don't ask that question. And I even in the commentary, might as well finish my point by even saying that really are such questions asked. But the other day on the Daily Show and Comedy Central and some others, they've asked a few of those questions of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And what you get are things about, well, we'll raise the corporate income tax. Yeah, the estimates are you'd have to double the corporate income tax and double the personal income tax. Also cutting defense spending and implementing a carbon tax, which we've never had in this country. Tax, more tax. And even then, you can't really get the dollars to budget and balance very well. But nevertheless, you're going to be hearing for quite some time this idea of free college tuition as well as Medicare for all. So that's why when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at this Gallup poll survey. It's one of the articles we've posted on the website, in which they found that a majority of Democrats, 57% to be exact, view socialism favorably compared to a new low of those who positively view free market or capitalism. Meanwhile, about 37% of Americans hold a positive view of socialism. And when you get down to the other side and you look at those who are Republicans or leaning Republicans, 71% hold a favorable view of capitalism. Only 16% hold a favorable view of socialism. So the other day we had somebody complain and say, you keep implying that Democrats are socialists. No, I'm just saying that some of the Democrats are socialists. But if you look at these polls, maybe I shouldn't have even backed off on that and say, a majority of Democrats really think socialism is better than capitalism. And that's all the more reason why I write these commentaries, and also one of the reasons why our most recent booklet that we've made available is a booklet called Capitalism and Socialism. If you don't have a copy of it, you might want to get it. You might want to pass it on to some of your friends just to kind of think through some of those issues. We'll take a break, and we'll get back to this issue right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We're in the midst of a battle over socialism. This isn't an academic debate about socialism. It isn't even a discussion about the impact of socialism on Venezuela.
The battle over socialism is taking place in the midterm campaigns led in part by self-proclaimed socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Two of the key talking points have been free college tuition and Medicare for all. These are not just fringe topics only discussed by a few radical leftists, but are becoming mainstream in the Democratic Party. Now, let me hasten to add that not all Democrats embrace these ideas, but most of the Democrats who will be running as presidential candidates in less than 2 years do propose such ideas. Voters need to be asking these candidates some important questions. Do we really want more government involvement in health care? Perhaps the most important questions are cost. One recent study found that Medicare for all would increase federal spending by more than $32 trillion during the first 10 years. By the way, total federal spending during that same period is projected to be about $56 trillion. So a good question for these candidates might be, how can we afford an additional $32 trillion? Rarely are such questions asked, but when they are asked of candidates, you get suggestions like raising the corporate income tax, cutting defense spending, and implementing a carbon tax. Then another question comes to mind. Won't that completely destroy our growing economy and crush manufacturing and other industries? This election and the next will be awash in socialist slogans about free tuition and free health care. Responsible voters need to ask these candidates some important questions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let's focus on the subject of capitalism and socialism. Let me just mention, too, that if you want to call in during this hour as we talk about capitalism and socialism, one of the things I'll make available to you is our little booklet on capitalism and socialism. Of course, you can also find information about all of that on our website, pointofview.net. And my commentary today, which I mentioned just a minute ago, is a commentary which is simply entitled Battle Over Socialism. I actually did it before this Gallup poll, but you can kind of see the trends. I remember more than a decade ago when we began to notice some of these trends changing, because we were noticing at that time those under the age of 30. Now, most of those would be under the age of 40 as well, and it would include most of the people that are in what we call the millennial generation. And maybe they can talk about this tomorrow on our Millennial Roundtable. But again, we found that about a third of those at that time who would fit into the millennial generation believed that capitalism was superior to socialism. About a third thought that socialism was superior to capitalism, and about a third had not made up their mind. They really had no opinion or really were not sure, which in a sense already was telling us that for the younger generation, two-thirds could not believe that capitalism was better than socialism. Now, I've said in some of my books, as a matter of fact, my most recent book on economics and Christians, that sometimes this gets back to a definitional issue. And in just a minute, I'm going to quote from Thomas Gallatin, who makes that point. The Gallup poll really doesn't define that. And sometimes when people hear the word capitalism, their mind rushes to somebody that is a capitalist or businessman. And you know as well as I do that Hollywood has, first of all, Hollywood loves making money. Hollywood loves the free enterprise system, but Hollywood producers and directors and scriptwriters also love to make the bad guy usually a capitalist. So if you hear the word capitalist,
lots of times you think of a movie in which you've seen a capitalist who ends up being the bad guy. And so you can understand why sometimes talking about a free market where people can freely exchange money for goods and services with limited government regulation, if you do that, maybe you get different numbers. But again, you assume that some people are intelligent enough to know what capitalism is and what socialism is, but that may be asking for quite a bit. So anyway, let me just quote from Thomas Gallatin. I'm going to get to the Gallup poll itself. But again, the Gallup poll that just came out said a majority of Democrats, that'd be 57%, view socialism favorably. And for a new low of those who actually view capitalism favorably. So that percentage of those who actually perceive capitalism in a favorable light has decreased over the last few years and over the last 2 decades, and has increased dramatically. And of course, socialism is being talked about because of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. So that's the case. By the other hand, if you look at those who are Republicans, or at least lean in that regard, 71% hold a favorable view of capitalism, and less than 20%, actually 16%, think socialism is viable. So this is kind of what you see right now. And what he says is, with Democratic numbers like this, it's not surprising to hear that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the new socialist face of the Democratic Party, assert that the whole country is further left than Congress. The whole country, the electorate, is way further left than Congress, but we have low voter turnout. That is not the case, but nevertheless, she's never allowed facts to get in the way of the studies that have been done, because even the most recent Gallup poll, when asked people to self-identify, about 40% identify themselves as conservative, about 40% identify themselves as moderate, and about 20% identify themselves as liberal. And when people self-identify, if anything, they tend to skew to what they think the pollster wants. So a lot of people probably are going to say, well, I don't want to say that I'm liberal, even if I feel like I am. I'll just say I'm a moderate. And so you, in some respects, maybe don't even have accurate numbers. But even using those, using the same Gallup poll, it doesn't make it sound at all like the country is as liberal as people might think that it is. But nevertheless, let's go on. He said the most interesting aspect of these latest poll numbers is the change in Democrats' opinion of capitalism. You think? Because back in 2010, it was only about 53% that held a favorable view. And when you go further back, it's even less. And so part of that may just be to the amount of attention that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others are getting. But nevertheless, there also is suggesting that maybe some of that's due to Trump derangement syndrome. In other words, if I think that Donald Trump is a capitalist and I don't like Donald Trump, then I'm for the other side. I'm for socialism. So that's a possibility. And Gallup notes it's possible that the drop in Democrats' positive view of capitalism is related to Donald Trump's presidency. Okay, so even Gallup poll acknowledges that. Because, as the Gallup poll says, Trump is an enthusiastic capitalist, and his administration's effort to roll back regulations on business and industry, as well as the tax cut law that were advantageous to business and corporations, may have caused Democrats to view the entire capitalist enterprise with less positive eyes. Okay, so that may be one of the reasons. But the other thing they do notice is the Gallup poll also notes the question wording does not define socialism or capitalism, but just simply asks respondents whether their opinion of each is positive or negative. And, of course, this is, as I just would point out, is an important kind of caveat. You don't know how many people have really thought through this issue. And the bottom line is that let's hope by the time we have our November election, some people have thought through this issue, but that may be asking for more than we can possibly ask for. Peter Hasson puts it this way. He says Democrats have a more positive view of socialism than they do of capitalism. Again, he gives us the numbers we've just looked at in just a minute. But he also points out that there are some reasons just in terms of the popularity, because it used to be that the Democratic Socialist of America, which is actually an organization, has never had visible representation in both the House and the Senate. Now you have a senator, Bernie Sanders, and you have some other Democrats who, even though they're not members of the Democratic Socialists of America, nevertheless hold to some of those views in the Senate. 17 individuals who are U.S. senators, agree with the idea of Medicare for all. So that's kind of a pretty close to a socialized medicine idea. But still, in the House, been hard to find, but you now have possibly two. One, of course, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I've mentioned her before, and again, she won a primary against, interestingly enough, an incumbent Democrat who is number 3 in terms of power in the House of Representatives, Joe Crowley, and so was able to defeat him in a primary in June. And now we just had another primary in Michigan, and Rashida Tlaib, who is actually another member of the Democratic Socialists, won her primary and perhaps will also be in Congress. So a lot of this visibility is maybe creating a little more positive idea of socialism. And as I've said before, even in my book and even in the little booklet that we make available to you, many of the younger generation, when you say socialism, they think of Venezuela, which is not necessarily positive, or they think of Cuba, but they don't think of Russia, and they don't think of Romania, and they don't think of Belarus, and they don't think of places where, or Algeria, where they, maybe those of us that are older, having gone through the Cold War, recognize what socialism really does. And so there's probably an educational issue. And when you add to this the fact that the largest employer in America is, drum roll please, the United States government. When you add the U.S. government and you add state and local governments, and then you recognize that most professors are essentially either in institutions that are supported by the tax dollar, so that sort of feels like socialism, or if they're in a private university, still they're not raising any funds, they're just dependent on somebody else to bring in the money. They are all experiencing what sort of feels like socialism, and they say, it works pretty well for me, and that's how we get government agencies to work, and that's how we feed the poor, and that's how we educate people. And so you can see why more and more individuals, at least in the Democratic Party, are convinced that socialism is indeed better than capitalism. And if you look at the numbers, it is really striking to see, and maybe I should plot this out here, just even over the last 8 years, from 2010 to 2018, how the view of capitalism declines for Democrats and the view of socialism increases. Whereas for the Republicans, it's pretty much the same. In 2010, there were 72% of Republicans, or those leaning Republican, had a positive view of capitalism. This time it was 71%. No difference whatsoever. 17% had a positive view of socialism back in 2010, 16% today, again within the margin of error. So the movement has not been in the Republican Party. The movement has been in the Democratic Party. So, again, I just wanted to put that on the table. It's one of those issues we've addressed on a number of occasions. And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about these rulings on guns that have really made a difference. And we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. Let's see if we can, for a few minutes, talk about guns and Second Amendment issues. Couple of things. First of all, the first article we've posted here has to do with the Stand Your Ground law and how that, I think, has been misinterpreted. And at least now I think justice is being done, because you may remember we've talked about this before, about this shooting that took place in Florida. You have Michael Drejka, who actually killed Marcus McLaughlin in a shooting that in many cases reignited this whole stand your ground self-defense law and the need for maybe at least the legislature and maybe even for some judges to deal with that. And then in just a minute, I want to talk about the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and their rulings that are, again, just making kind of hash out of some of these laws and the Second Amendment, which is why many people are starting to predict that maybe we're going to have another Second Amendment case that makes its way to the Supreme Court. It could be the Ninth Circuit Court, most likely, since that's already on its way possibly to an appeal, or it could be even the reevaluation of the Stand Your Ground law in Florida. If you're not familiar with the case, let me take the Florida one because it's pretty simple, and then we'll get on to the bigger one. And that is Michael Drejka shot McLaughlin after an argument at a convenience store in Tampa Bay, Florida. I encourage you to watch it, but even if you only watch part of it, and a lot of the news, to give them credit, show up to the shooting, but you can see what happens next. You see what happens, and that is Marcus McLaughlin and his girlfriend, Brittany Jacobs, along with their children, pull into a handicapped parking spot. Okay, that's where it starts, because Michael Drejka, in the past, has been very confrontative about people parking in a handicapped parking space. Okay, I understand that. So anyway, they go in to get some snacks, and Jacobs and two of the kids remain in the car, but the 5-year-old son goes in with Marcus. When they come out, Marcus sees that there is already an argument between Michael Drejka and Brittany, the girlfriend. And so, in not something I recommend, he comes up and pushes him to the ground. Okay, right off the bat, that, can escalate a situation that did not need to be escalated. You want to think about what you can do to de-escalate a situation. Well, while Drejka's on the ground, he just pulls out a gun and goes into the store and dies in front of his son. Now, the argument that came from the Pinellas County Sheriff was that since this was sort of a stand-your-ground circumstance, he said the law in the state of Florida today is that people have the right to stand their ground and have a right to defend themselves when they believe they're in harm. Yeah, but when somebody pushes you to the ground, you have the right to push them back, but you don't have a right to go out and shoot them. And so we've had all sorts of people, including our good friend David French, has been on the program, who has said that this was a bad misstatement of the law, and I would agree. So whether you're a supporter of the National Rifle Association, whether you're a supporter of Handgun Control of America, whether you're for the I think this is one place where we can all agree this was a miscarriage of justice. So the good news is that now, of course, he has been charged with manslaughter. And long, but of course a lot of it had to do with some of the protest. Is African American, so a lot of people were making a case about that. I don't care if he's white, black. It makes sense, and it did not make sense, especially if indeed when you look at the autopsy, he actually, of course you can see this in the video too, was turning. So he pushes the guy down, is going to get in his car and leave. Is kind of looking like what was going to happen, and that's when he gets shot. It's one thing to say, I'm going to throat, and then you feel like the only thing you can do to keep your, but that's not the action that was taken. Of course, since we have a video camera, we know exactly what took place. That one, and if you'd like to know the whole story and read the details, that is the first article we've posted today on the web. A phone call from somebody wanting to know Well, since that has been ruled in the Ninth Circuit Court, does that affect me in Missouri? Well, the answer is no, but nevertheless, this is how David French puts it. He said, weeks after two different Ninth Circuit Court panels surprisingly upheld the Second Amendment rights by blocking California's confiscation of large-capacity magazines and Hawaii's ban on open carry, the nation's most progressive circuit returned to form. He says a ruling earlier this month that upheld one of the most bizarre, and I agree with him, we'll get into that in just a minute, and nonsensical gun regulations in the nation. It did so by essentially ignoring the plain language of the Heller decision. That's the Supreme Court decision that came out of the Washington, D.C. area, and proving a legal regime that will naturally and inevitably lead to diminishing options for citizens who seek to lawfully exercise their constitutional right of self-defense. And so here are the facts, he says. The California unsafe handgun law requires new handguns sold in the state to have three safety features. Number one, new guns must have an indicator that shows when a round is loaded in the weapon's chamber. Since I know enough about guns, I do know that some guns do provide that. Many do not. Second, new guns must have a magazine detachment mechanism that prevents the gun from discharging when a magazine is not in it. Hate to tell you, but most guns, even if you remove the magazine, if there's one in the chamber, it still will shoot. Okay, so that's hard to find. And the third one, I don't know of any gun in the country that does this. Number three, the third provision requires all new handguns to stamp microscopically the handgun's make, model, and serial number onto every fired shell casing. As he says, the Unsafe Handgun Act is just as problematic as it sounds. You think? Because he points out that even in the decision that came down from the Ninth Circuit Court, they said, and I'm quoting now from the Ninth Circuit, according to the plaintiffs, no handguns were available in the United States that met the micro-stamping requirements. The record does not indicate whether or how these figures have changed over time, unquote. Basically, that means that, no, that provision is not been met. That provision does not exist. That provision is not available in any handgun. And most importantly, what that means is that if you're in the state of California and you're buying a handgun, you're actually technically in violation of that law, because anybody that bought a handgun after this so-called Unsafe Handgun Act was passed does not meet for sure that third criteria. Most of the others aren't met as well. And so here's how California gets around it. California has grandfathered a list of makes and models of handguns exempted from the law. But the list, David French points out, doesn't include the number of the most popular models in the United States. And for that matter, the gun manufacturers, the gun makers, have to pay a fee to the state of California to keep their weapons on the list. Do you love that? That's just amazing. So he says, naturally, the list is shrinking. The end of 2013, the handgun roster contained 1,200 handguns and 883 semi-automatics. As of the oral argument, it contained 744 handguns and 496 semi-automatics. And pretty soon, nobody's going to be on the list because nobody wants to pay the money. So the point he's making is, and we'll take a break and talk more about what this means in just a minute. He said, let's be clear. This law represents slow motion prohibition. He says, imagine if California passed an unsafe automobile act that said all new cars sold had to either come from a roster of models approved by the state only after their manufacturers paid a fee for it, or be able to fly. Each year, the approved roster shrank as car makers either discontinued models or refused to pay the fees. And each year, car makers refused to design and build flying cars. Yes, that's kind of what we are talking about here with this micro-stamping requirement. And again, we know what the goal is, to try to come up with the most onerous regulations possible so that it looks like you're being responsible, but so that you eventually have a situation which nobody in the state of California could buy a new gun, and then the next step is to try to figure out whether or not to actually force individuals whose guns do not meet those requirements to turn them in. So we'll see where that goes, but it, I think, brings us to something we'll talk about after the break, and that is, in light of just these two stories we have on the website today, don't you think it's about time for the Supreme Court to come back to this issue of the Second Amendment, and especially with a few individuals on the court that are a little different than were there before, Neil Gorsuch, as well as Brett Kavanaugh? Maybe we'll get some clear decisions coming down this time. We'll keep our conversation going on this right after these messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Jerry Boykin has never shied away from a fight. As the CEO of the Family Research Council today, Boykin regularly shares his opinions on a variety of issues from his religious perspective. But Boykin hasn't always been at FRC. A photo recently surfaced of Boykin from 1980. The black and white photo features a youthful Boykin, a major in the U.S. Army then, with dark hair and matching beard. He's addressing a group of about 100 Army Delta Force operators. The room is nondescript, cement walls covered with exposed wiring with but one decoration, a poster. And that's not just any poster. It's a collage of the pictures of the 100 Americans held hostage in Iran. Boykin's Delta Force was about to go rescue them, but Boykin and his men first paused to pray. Many might second-guess this decision. Some might suggest that it was even illegal for Boykin to use his authority to coerce his men into praying. Others might conclude that the act was little more than civil religion, a meaningless act with no more efficacy than if the operators had gathered together and yelled, "Go team!" But for the men about to dive into the face of death and danger, prayer is what they wanted and needed. Thankfully, though our service members sacrifice much in the cause of freedom, they do not give up their religious freedom. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and don't forget that in the next hour we've got Michael Youssef with us. Life-Changing Prayers, How God Displays His Power to Ordinary People. And again, just it's one of those books where once you read it, you go, of course, what a great theme for a book, to look at some of these very powerful prayers in the Old Testament, and then to say, what can we learn about that in terms of prayer today? So I think you're really going to enjoy the book. And as you might imagine, it's endorsed by Mark Batterson, a circle maker, O.S. Hawkins, Elmer Towns of Liberty, Jim Cymbala, and a couple of others. So anyway, great book and a great conversation with Michael Youssef. And I got a feeling he's going to have a few comments to say. We won't start with that, but a little bit later I'll ask him about what about this compound in New Mexico where the Muslims there were training kids to kill other kids in schools. So we got a lot to cover, but let me finish this real quickly. This is the second article on the website by David French about the Ninth Circuit Court returns to form upholds bizarre California gun regulation. And the deal breaker, actually, each one of these could be, I recognize, yes, there are guns that are in existence that have an indicator that show when a round is loaded in the weapon's chamber. To begin to design a gun that would not fire if the magazine was detached changes a lot of the mechanics of almost every standard semi-automatic firearm. So that one is pretty close to a deal breaker. But the real deal breaker is this idea of micro stamping. Now, what is so interesting is that even though there is no gun out there that does this, did that cause the Ninth Circuit Court to say, you know, this might be a little draconian. This might be demanding a little too much. Remember, this is the same Ninth Circuit Court that said there's really nothing wrong with telling a pregnancy crisis pregnancy center and a pregnancy center that they have to advertise for abortion. That's not over the top. That's not draconian. And here, the same kind of statement was being made. Again, I'm reading from Ninth Circuit Court. They said simply because no gun manufacturer is even considering trying to implement this technology, that is, that microstamping technology, it does not follow that microstamping is technologically infeasible. They also went on, simply showing that the number of handguns on the roster has decreased does not tell how much or whether the availability of handguns has declined in a way relevant to the Second Amendment. It is not the number of handguns on the roster that matters, it's the impact on self-defense in the home. And I love what David French puts out. He says, one gets the impression that the panel would be completely untroubled if the legal market for handguns shrank to simply a revolver or two, because they'd say, after all, citizens can still buy a gun, right? As David French has pointed out before, and I also point out in my booklet on the Second Amendment. By the way, I have booklets on capitalism and socialism. I also have a booklet on the Second Amendment. I use the argument that David French uses, and that is when people say, why do you need a semi-automatic handgun? Or why do you need a semi-automatic rifle? And the simple answer is that the person coming in your front door, burglar, mugger, terrorist, that's what he or she will have. And so the question is, do you want to have something comparable to what the bad guy is going to have? Of course you do. This is one of the reasons why it is very rare anymore when I'm with somebody in law enforcement that I see that they have a revolver. Oh, yeah, you can find lethal weapon where you have the two individuals, one shooting a Beretta and the other shooting a revolver. But the reality is that is kind of almost old school. Virtually every individual that I run into in law enforcement is packing a .40 caliber Glock. And almost anybody that you know that has been in the military has up until recently been carrying a Beretta, a 9mm. Now they're probably carrying a Sig Sauer. And the reality is that's because look what you're going to have to go up against. And so if you're going up against a gangbanger, some kind of criminal, what will that individual have in his or her hands? And the bottom line is maybe they'll have a revolver. I doubt it. They're probably going to have a semi-automatic weapon. And because of that, they will be able to fire continuously. And they'll also have a clip so that they can fire more than just the number of rounds in that particular clip. Of course, the Ninth Circuit Court, at least to their credit, said that California was not supposed to confiscate large capacity magazines, but then they came right around with this particular case in which they felt that there was really no problem with the Unsafe Handgun Act, which would, as we pointed out before, require that you have an indicator that shows whether a round is loaded in the weapon, that the gun itself would not actually fire unless the magazine were actually in the chamber. And third, most importantly, that the handguns would be able to stamp microscopically the handgun's make, model, and serial number. And that's why near the end of the article here, which we've posted on the website for you to read in its entirety, David French simply says this: there is now a desperate need for the Supreme Court to step forward. Perhaps with Brett Kavanaugh confirmed, the court will be less reluctant to take a Second Amendment case. In fact, if it can affirm two simple truths, that the right to bear arms protects open or concealed carry outside the home, and that common use standard means what it says, it will go a long way to settling most of the contentious gun control cases of our time. That second point that he's talking about in terms of common use goes all the way back to the decision ruled in the Heller case. Again, I talk about that in my little booklet on the Second Amendment, in which Justice Antonin Scalia made the statement that the Second Amendment protects weapons in common use for lawful purposes. So the idea of common use, what's common use? Well, that would be an AR-15 or something similar to that. That would be like a normal semi-automatic handgun, and that those would be in common use for lawful purposes. And some people say, well, then that would allow for a machine gun. No, machine guns, automatic weapons have been banned since the 1930s. So again, if the court could just kind of clarify a few key points, then a lot of the cases that we seem to be talking about almost ad nauseum now here on Point of View would simply go away. But I wanted to give you those two because, again, we've got, I think, finally a proper ruling on the stand your ground killing in Tampa, Florida, and then a really bizarre ruling from our Ninth Circuit Court. Just before we end this hour, I thought, if nothing else, I would say you might want to pray for this particular Tex-Mex restaurant, the El Tiempo Cantina in Houston. If you haven't been paying attention, those of you in Texas probably are very familiar with this because they had posted a picture of one of the members, actually I think it was the son of the owner, with the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. He happened to be in town, and so they posted the picture and said it was an honor for them to serve the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who had delivered a speech in Houston that day. Well, you know what happened next, and even if you don't, you can guess what happened next, and that is there was an enormous backlash of people that opposed Donald Trump's immigration policies, saw again, Jeff Sessions as a key administrator that is guilty of that. And so, unfortunately, very quickly, they had to backtrack, say that they regretted that the post angered so many people, and they had to delete their post. I would say, again, if it had been the other way around and we disagreed with what Eric Holder, Attorney General, had said, I still say I doubt there would have been a backlash. If there'd been a picture with President Barack Obama or even Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, everybody go, great, I'm glad it turned out. But if you post a picture right now of Donald Trump or Jeff Sessions or anybody in the cabinet, expect a backlash, and that's what he actually received. Let's take a break. Michael Youssef with us next. That coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking with our good friend Michael Youssef, and this is one of those books where you see it and you say, oh, what a great idea. Why didn't I think of this? And it really just helps us begin to think about the subject of prayer by looking at 7 of the really key prayers, mostly in the Old Testament, one in the New Testament, and what we can learn from these individuals in their prayers that we can apply to our lives. So in some respects, this is not only a book about prayer, but it's also just a kind of a great overview of the Old Testament and the New Testament and the spiritual life. I think you're going to find this fascinating as we talk with our good friend, Dr. Michael Youssef, who is the founder and president of Leading the Way. Been on the program with us many times before, but you probably know him best through his radio program and especially his weekly television programs, which are now broadcast in 25 different languages, seen worldwide. Of course, he's known as the founding pastor of the Church of the Apostles in Atlanta, has, as we've mentioned before, a PhD in social anthropology from Emory University. And the last couple of times we've talked about some of his books. He's got about 36 books, but more recently we've talked about Jesus, Jihad, and Peace. And then the most recent one, The Barbarians Are Here. This new book, Life-Changing Prayers, endorsed by Mark Batterson, O.S. Hawkins, Jim Cymbala, and all sorts of individuals that have been on the program. So, Michael Youssef, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
It was always a delight, always just a joy when I see your name inviting me to come, and I really enjoy our discussions. You're such a thoughtful, intellectual, and yet practical host, and I'm so grateful to be on your show.
Talk about the origin of this book. People know you as kind of a person that speaks on contemporary issues and prophecy and things of that nature. I know, of course, you've preached on prayer, but this was, I think, just genius to think about, if I want to talk about prayer, why not just look at these very significant prayers of Hannah and David and Daniel and Jonah and Eleazar and Habakkuk and people like that. What's the origin of this book?
Well, I want to be truthful about this. It was the idea that Michael Hyatt came down here 17 years ago, literally, and said to me, he said, I believe you are the person who would write such a book. And I thought about it, and then I decided a few years later to do a series. I called it, of preaching, and called it Ordinary People, Extraordinary Prayer. I think the bottom line is that we all need modeling. Everybody needs modeling. I have people who have modeled for me what it is to live a godly life as a pastor, and I've always been grateful to these people. I call them my giants. I'm standing on their shoulders. And so in reality, when a pastor, and I've been pastoring for 45 years now, you start talking about prayer, everybody in the pew starts groaning.
Yes.
You know why? Because there's really very few people feel good about their prayer life.
Very true.
So the guilt starts going on. Oh, we're going to talk about prayer, and I'm not, I wish I could, and all this stuff. And I said, I remember the discussion I had with Mike back then. I said, another book on prayer. Everybody, it's just, and I don't want to do that. And he said, no, this will be different. This will be modeling. And so I prayed and thought about it. Lord began to really guide me to those individuals because their prayer is so powerful But also I want to introduce a variety of circumstances. Whether it be choosing a spouse, whether it would be desperately praying for having a baby, or you are running from God and you're in the middle of this sushi festival inside the whale, as Jonah was, and wherever those all 7 different circumstances, and that's why I picked those particular prayer. And then I decided to put them in a book, and our friends at Baker were really delighted. They kept saying, "This is the book we want to publish first for you." There are 2 more coming on, not on prayer, but on just really big things in the church that we need to be talking about. But they said, we want to start with this one. So I'm so grateful Baker Books picked that to be the first one in this series. And I really am praying that God just use it because it's a simple book. It's not a complicated book. It's a simple book, but God can use it in a way that can really ignite the prayer life of so many in the church today.
Talking with Michael Youssef, and again, Leading the Way, which stands for, again, if you want to go to the website, ltw.org. Of course, we have a link there. Also have a link to the book. I would imagine you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a way that you can order it either in paperback or Kindle. And just before we get into those 7 different prayers, you begin by talking about the idea of ordinary. That was the original title of your sermon, and even the subtitle, How God Displays His Power to Ordinary People. And you said you and I are ordinary people, and that is, I think, helpful because, Michael Youssef, what happens sometimes is when we look at these individuals in Scripture, we sort of say, well, they're the super saints. You know, okay, we might say we're the saints, but we aren't the super saints. These are people that are very different than we are. No, they're not. They're ordinary people just like we are, aren't they?
Yes, and I forever saying to my congregation, I am indebted to the Holy Spirit of God, because when He was the overall author of the Scripture, I am so grateful that He did not take these people out in the back room and really scrub them and wash them and then starch them and iron them and then cover them with a cellophane paper and place them on a pedestal and said, now you imitate them. I could never do that. I could never relate to them. But He shows us their dirty feet and their dirty hands, and He shows us their failure, and so we can relate to them. You call them super saints? Well, they're not any more super saints than we are. They had their own foibles. They had their own failures and their shortcomings and Achilles' heels. And so every time I deal with a character study and teaching, I point this out so that we can relate to them. In my failure, I relate to so many of the characters in the Bible. But also the other danger is that we think there are some people, even in the church in 21st century, they're the prayer warriors. They're the ones who need to send your prayers to, because if they lay hands on it, God is going to answer those prayers. No, God cares as much, if not more, for the simple individual, young or old, who takes Him seriously, who believes that our God is the God of the impossible, and therefore they start praying, but as they're praying, do self-examination. And, Jesus gave us this kind of very simple approach about our needs. He said, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things, what are they? They're all of our needs.
That's right.
Be added to you. And so I find myself some days when I'm delighting myself in the presence of God, and I'm rejoicing, and I'm praying for the I'm praying for the work of God around the world, and I'm really having a wonderful time worshiping, adoring my Savior. By the time I come to the end, and I know there are certain needs, and I find myself just thanking Him that He's going to meet those in His timing.
Well, we're going to take a break, and we'll get back to the life-changing prayers right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We're in the midst of a battle over socialism. This isn't an academic debate about socialism. It isn't even a discussion about the impact of socialism on Venezuela. The battle over socialism is taking place in the midterm campaigns led in part by self-proclaimed socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Two of the key talking points have been free college tuition and Medicare for all. These are not just fringe topics only discussed by a few radical leftists, but are becoming mainstream in the Democratic Party. Now, let me hasten to add that not all Democrats embrace these ideas, but most of the Democrats who will be running as presidential candidates in less than 2 years do propose such ideas. Voters need to be asking these candidates some important questions. Do we really want more government involvement in health care? Perhaps the most important questions are cost. One recent study found that Medicare for all would increase federal spending by more than $32 trillion during the first 10 years. By the way, total federal spending during that same period is projected to be about $56 trillion. So a good question for these candidates might be, how can we afford an additional $32 trillion? Rarely are such questions asked, but when they are asked of candidates, you get suggestions like raising the corporate income tax, cutting defense spending, and implementing a carbon tax. Then another question comes to mind. Won't that completely destroy our growing economy and crush manufacturing and other industries? This election and the next will be awash in socialist slogans about free tuition and free health care. Responsible voters need to ask these candidates some important questions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, privileged to have with us today Michael Youssef, the new book that is just out, Life-Changing Prayers, How God Displays His Power to Ordinary People, published by our good friends at Baker, about 200 pages, and we're going to look at 7, so you might, if you're taking some notes, number 1 to 7, and we're going to go, first of all, to Genesis 24, and Eleazar. And right off the bat, I would have to say that a few people, Michael Youssef, might not remember who Eleazar is. Probably best to describe him as what? The chief of staff of Abraham. But what do we learn from Eleazar's dilemma and Eleazar's prayer?
Well, the first thing is that, we do not know about his relationship with the Lord. It's the interest. This is why I chose him. And many reasons, but this is one of them. We know that he watched his master, Abraham, in intimacy with God, and he probably was there when the angels appeared, when they gave the promise of the birth of Isaac. He was there probably at the time when Abraham messed up and thought he wanted to help God out, and had Ishmael, and he probably had a front seat as to watch that relationship of his master Abraham with the Lord. And the amazing part is that he developed such a confidence in that God, because he watched him keep his word to his master, even if it took 25 years. So he knew he's a faithful God just from watching. And it's the amazing thing to me is that people are watching us. They're watching whether we really practice what we preach, and when we go through the difficult times, are we really in praising, or are just complaining like everybody else? People are watching us, and especially those who are close to us, our children, our family. And so that's vitally important. That's the second thing, is that So he goes into this situation that his master puts him in, and he said, look, my God will go before you. So with that confidence, he prays. And he asks God for a simple sign, because he doesn't know. He doesn't have a history with God, but he saw that with his master. So he comes in, and he's looking for a character, somebody that would have that character, and that's why Abraham did not want his son to marry one of the Philistines and the Canaanites who were there. So he sends him back to Ur of Chaldees, and he says, God will go with you. So he says, now, Lord, I don't know what to do here. I'm a novice at this. I'm going to choose a wife for my master's son, and I don't know what to do.
Yes.
And so he basically says, well, the one way to know the character of that person is to ask her if she would give me a drink, but if she really offered to give a drink to my camels, then I know she is a person of character and perseverance and so on. And so I explained in the book, most people don't realize this, that a camel can drink upward of 25 gallons of water. we don't know that. We don't.
I did not know that. Yes.
Yeah, and we think that they store that water in their hump. That's why it's called the ship of the desert. But it's not. It's in the cell. The cell enlarges, and so they can survive for a week or two without water because they drink so much at one time. So think of 10 camels, and this poor girl, when she said, I can give your camels a drink, even if she gave them 10 gallons, not 25, that's 100 times she would push this thing, this bucket in the well, and pulls it back up. And I mean, that was a huge commitment. And so he sees that, and he said, okay, that's the one. She's not only beautiful, but she has the character that goes with it. And therefore, he moves in confidence and in faith to come with me. You're going to be the wife of my master's son.
Well, again, let me just mention, while you talk about that, let's recognize that the bucket that you're pulling down in the well probably has a gallon. So that means she would have to draw up from the well 90 times, if you think about this. And if Eleazar's camels were dehydrated, 270 times. So I never knew that till this, but it just illustrates again, talk about going above and beyond their requirements. Just a great illustration. And that's Eleazar. I'm going to keep it moving because I want to go through all seven. So let's move on, if we can, to Hannah. This is very familiar. 1 Samuel chapter 1, because we all know the story of Hannah. Hannah means favored or gracious, but she didn't feel favored because of her circumstances. Please continue.
Exactly, because, obviously, at least this is my deduction, is that from her graciousness, when she couldn't have children, she obviously, just like Sarah did, offered her husband to have another wife. And so the wife was producing children, but instead of being gracious back to her, she was beating her up verbally and persecuting her, really, in every sense of the word. And that really added insult to injury. So the hurt was so deep. But the most amazing thing about Hannah, this is really what a lot of people miss. So sure, she prayed. She cried her eyes out to God. And, so much so that even the priest Eli thought she was drunk. And when in reality she was not. And she was just so impassionate about her prayer. But she said to God, I'll give you the son. And that a lot of people said, God, if you get me out of this, I'll do that. The kind of the kind of desperation. And then when God answers their prayer, we said, well, it would have happened anyway. And they don't keep their word. This dear woman, she absolutely kept her word. As soon as she weaned him, she took him back to the house of God, and she said, I made God a promise. I am keeping my promise. And here's the great thing. Again, most people miss it. Well, you know what God did? He gave a whole bunch of kids.
Right.
Sons and daughters, in order to honor. You see, God said, I honor those who honor me. In fact, it was Samuel, her son. When he got older, he said that. He said, I honor those who honor me, says the Lord. And so God honored her and blessed her and replaced what I call the years that are eaten by the locust, the years of tears and grief and sorrow over what the the other wife of Cana was doing to her. And so consequently, I tell people, I said, don't make a vow to God unless you're planning on keeping it. There are some people, they go and they make these pledges and they never keep them. And that's sad because the loss is humongous in the long term. But so I said, it's better not to make a vow. Don't make a pledge. Don't make a commitment unless you're making it by faith and saying, God, if you provide it, I do it. That's different. But if you make a promise, you better keep it, because that's where God's blessing comes in as a result of that keeping of the promise.
Let me also mention those of you that are Bible study teachers or pastors or others. There's some great material that obviously all the way through this book you can use in a series of sermons. And you have 5 ingredients of Hannah's prayer that all start with the letter S, surrender and the prayer of persistence and sorrow, as well as supplication, the song, because we have that song in 1 Samuel 2, as well as the final point of sacrifice, the selfless sacrificial vow. So there is just some great material here, Michael Youssef, that individuals can use, because even in the epilogue, you've got some other material. So I would hope that some that maybe wanted to teach on prayer and said, I get a groan from my congregation or from my Sunday school class or my small group when we do prayer. This may be a really good way to teach it, and you've got a lot of great sub-points in there that would make this to be a great 7-week series or something like that, don't you think?
Absolutely, and it was so amazing. I was at the Rose Garden on the National Day of Prayer. There must be 5 pastors who walked up to me and said, "Hey, we preach your sermons." I said, "Great, you want them in writing?" Great. One pastor said, the first time I confessed it, I said, I got that information from you. The second time I said, the Lord gave it to me, and I said, you don't need to mention me at all.
That's so
Another
good.
pastor here in Atlanta said to my congregation, actually, I had him come and speak, and Crawford Loretz, you know him probably.
Oh, I sure do. We've had him on.
Said, he said, I've been trying to think what to say to you about your pastor, and he said, the only thing I can come up with is that he does all my research for me.
This is a great lines. We need to take a break. When we come back, we've only done 2 of the 7, but I think if we keep this going, we'll do pretty well. When we come back, we're going to talk about certainly the prayer of David. So for those of you following along, you might go to Psalm 28, and then we'll go to Daniel, which is a natural, Jonah, which is also a natural. If we have enough time, we'll also do Habakkuk and Mary. And again, just part of the book, Life-Changing Prayers, How God Displays His Power to Ordinary People, published by Baker. It is available in your local bookstore. Endorsements by Mark Batterson, O.S. Hawkins, Jim Cymbala, to mention just a few. And so we'll take a break, and we'll continue our conversation. If you'd like to know more about Michael Youssef, about leading the way, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Michael Youssef. Again, the book is entitled Life-Changing Prayers, How God Displays His Power to Ordinary People. 7 prayers. We've looked at a couple, and we'll keep it going. And if you would like to know more about this book, we have information on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, we have a link to Leading the Way. Before we're done, we'll talk about some of those resources. But, Michael, let's, if we can, go to David and his prayer. You use Psalm 28. Of course, we could use others, but this is a prayer for mercy and justice, and such an important prayer for us to learn about as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I chose this. Of course, there's so many choices in the book of Psalms, but I chose that one because this was probably one of the most painful times. It's one thing when he was battling Saul and running away from Saul when he had nothing. And it's another thing when you're a king and then you really run away from your palace and your staff and your life that you got used to. And of all the add insult to injury, the hurt of all hurts, it's his son, Absalom. And so it's an impassionate prayer, and it comes from a man who was literally so broken before God. And David is one person I identify with probably the most in the Scripture. I'm the runt in the family like David was. I had 3 brothers. One was 19. The other one was 19 years older than me. Another was 17 years older than me. One 11 years older than me. 2 of them were bank presidents. One was so brilliant economist. He was, basically would draft the national budget for the country of my birth. So I'm saying this because I understand when you're the runt and
yes,
basically coming along so late in life and you flunked math. If I did not know that my whole story of birth, I thought I would be adopted. But anyway, as the runt, I felt so much and I identify so much with David. And so this prayer particularly really kind of grips me and gets to me more than all the others, and they're all, of course, meaningful. And so he was crying to God for mercy and for justice and self-examination, and he would say to the Lord, I'm placing my confidence in you. My confident request is in you that I'm presenting all of my reasoned argument based on the fact that you anointed me, that you called me. And then he put, as you said, I do outlines that I work hard on. And so when I talk about confident request and reasoned argument and rejoicing, his cause for rejoicing, because his confidence has always been, from the moment he came on the scene and defeated Goliath, his confidence has always been in the Lord. And the Lord loves that. I really believe the Lord loves to hear the prayers of those who say, God, it doesn't matter what I have or don't have, you are everything to me. You mean everything to me. And your mercy, your grace is what makes me literally want to get out of bed in the morning. And those kinds of impassionate prayers, whether you are in a time of trouble or not, I think, in fact, it's wonderful to be dependent on the Lord in times when you really don't need anything, except everything's going well. But you go back to Him and say, Lord, the very reason I'm drawing a breath this very moment is because of your mercy and your grace. And begin to praise God and thank Him for that. And then you present your case to Him, which He already knows anyway, and you say, Lord, your will be done, not mine.
Just fascinating material. Let me just keep it moving because I want to come to the book of Daniel, Daniel 9, and that's a prayer of confession and repentance. Again, we think of some of the other times of Daniel's prayers. Again, you have so many choices with David. You have a number of choices with Daniel, but let's talk about the lessons we can learn there in terms of confession and repentance.
Well, Daniel chapter 9 is, one time I actually got up and I prayed that prayer for our congregation. It is a wonderful corporate prayer. But the amazing thing about this, we don't know anything about Daniel's sin, and most likely there was nothing glaring at that moment. But he begins with confession because he knew that his people have sinned against God, and he knows that his people, and he identifies with them. And so when even we as individual believers or in the church or as pastors or church leaders, when we confess the sin of our nation, we say, look, we sin too because, we're part of this. We identify with it. And a broken and contrite heart God will not despise. And therefore, when Daniel begins by confessing and repenting, and he was doing this not only on his behalf, but on behalf of his people, because he knows that this exile came as a result of people turning their back on God and running after Baal and other gods, and gods that really are dumb and cannot do anything, and just that foolishness. And so he confesses that foolishness to God. Without that, he knew that he can't go first base with God. And so he starts with confession and repentance, and he does that on his own behalf and behalf of the nation, because he is really the leader of his nation in the time of exile. He's in the palace. He's been favored by the kings, both the Babylonians and the Persians, and therefore he, as he pleads with God and asks for God to forgive them, then he affirms God's glory. He said, Lord, it is your glory that we're after. It is the name that's above every name that we're after. And when Jesus taught us to pray, the first thing he said, hallowed be thy name. That's where you start. Father in heaven, blessed be your name. That name is very important. And when David came on the scene and saw Goliath defying the army of the living God, he was livid simply because the name of his beloved Lord was taken in vain. And so Daniel focuses on the glory of God, and even though he is a man who has been giving wonderful visions, even visions of the future, that, as we know, most of them have been fulfilled already, and yet he comes to God asking for mercy and asks on behalf of others, and then he basically says, God, it is your glory. That's our ultimate aim and our ultimate goal of my prayer.
Well, again, one of the things I appreciate about your book is not only do you, of course, take us back, in this case, to the Old Testament, but you put it in context, because there's about 5 pages in which you tell the story of Coach Joe Kennedy, who in some respects is kind of a modern-day Daniel, who simply goes to the 50-yard line and prays a very short prayer after a football game, and was fired, and this case has made its way through the courts all the way to the appeals court. So you take some time as well to take a particular principle that we learn in the Old or New Testament and apply it to some of the things we're dealing with today, even on our program.
Absolutely. I hear every day, I hear something. A top executive in a major company, a global company in Sydney, Australia, got fired because he took a stand on marriage. A doctor in England was fired from the national medical thing after 30 years, simply because he refused to call a person either he or she, and he said either he or she, and they said no. If the person that wants to be called he or she, he said no, I can't do that. He lost his job, and it's every single day I get information, news like this from all over the world. And so we are seeing more and more Daniels, and I think we're going to be hearing a lot of more of Daniel's prayer in the lives of many believers in the church in the West.
Well, I certainly would agree with that, and that's another reason to have this book, because in some respects you are actually seeing the very desperate prayers of individuals who, in the case of David, are running away from his son and his family, Daniel, who's dealing with all the tension that he's had to deal with. And so when we come back from the break, what about Jonah, a prayer from the depths of despair? And again, you start out with the Walt Disney animated classic Pinocchio, but it's important to understand really exactly what Jonah was going through, and whether you find yourself in the belly of a big fish, which is very doubtful, or in the midst of a storm where you have the same kind of despair, we can learn something from his prayer. Also, we have the prayer of Habakkuk, and if we have time, we'll also go to the New Testament and talk about the prayer of Mary. So lots of great material in this book. Let me again encourage those of you that are teachers or preachers, you might want to use this in a way that you can educate your congregation about prayer in a way that might give it a fresh new look and really encourage them to learn a little bit more, not only about the Old and New Testament, but also about these so-called heroes of the faith. But they were just ordinary people, and how can we today model their prayers by learning how they prayed when they were in positions or circumstances that were very difficult. We'll continue our conversation with Michael Youssef right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Jerry Boykin has never shied away from a fight. As the CEO of the Family Research Council today, Boykin regularly shares his opinions on a variety of issues from his religious perspective. But Boykin hasn't always been at FRC. A photo recently surfaced of Boykin from 1980. The black and white photo features a youthful Boykin, a major in the U.S. Army then, with dark hair and matching beard. He's addressing a group of about 100 Army Delta Force operators. The room is nondescript, cement walls covered with exposed wiring with but one decoration, a poster. And that's not just any poster. It's a collage of the pictures of the 100 Americans held hostage in Iran. Boykin's Delta Force was about to go rescue them, but Boykin and his men first paused to pray. Many might second-guess this decision. Some might suggest that it was even illegal for Boykin to use his authority to coerce his men into praying. Others might conclude that the act was little more than civil religion, a meaningless act with no more efficacy than if the operators had gathered together and yelled, "Go team!" But for the men about to dive into the face of death and danger, prayer is what they wanted and needed. Thankfully, though our service members sacrifice much in the cause of freedom, they do not give up their religious freedom. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Michael Youssef. The book is again entitled Life-Changing Prayers. About 200 pages, published by Baker. You can find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a way in which you can order it either in paperback or in Kindle on our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we have a link also to Leading the Way, which is the organization that is associated with Michael Youssef. Michael, in the interest of time, let's move immediately to Jonah. a prayer from the depths of despair. And whether you're running away from God, you find yourself in a difficult set of circumstances, you have some very important principles that we see there in terms of how, indeed, we, in the case of Jonah, have a couple of key features that are actually modeled for us while he is in the belly of this big fish.
Exactly. And, I also identify with Jonah because I tried to run away from the Lord after I accepted him as Savior for 18 months because I thought I didn't want to go to the ministry. And God brought me back. I was preaching in London just a few weeks ago, and I preached a sermon called But Jonah. I didn't realize that a former pastor in that church who's been away from the Lord for 23 years was sitting in the front, and that was the turning point in which he gave his life to Christ and rededicated himself. But
wow.
Jonah is really an amazing character because there's something in him that kind of want to do God's will, but something else is saying, no, I'd rather not do that. and his struggle. And I think many of your listeners, Kerby, know that. And I know that experientially, and that tension. But then when he really confessed and then was thrown overboard, and he gets into this, what I call a sushi festival. I mean, he was just living inside that whale on raw fish, and every time the whale moves, he probably shakes his stomach, and that experience that none of us will ever understand, and that's so much incredible that now modern pastors are even denying it happened. But in reality, he cries to God, and now recrimination. I said, God, I know you allowed this to happen because of my disobedience, and this total humility, and he talks about his condition of how the waves and the breakers and where he is, and then he thanks God. As a matter of fact, he starts by saying, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. It starts with a point of faith that even though I'm crying to God, I know that he will answer me, and therefore he even puts it in the past tense. In my distress, I called upon the Lord, and he answered me. It's a powerful prayer of a man who literally is tormented, was torn between doing the will of God in his life and then kind of trying to improve on it and do his own thing. And I've met many business people, particularly businessmen, who have that struggle in their life, and I've ministered to them in that way. But that's it's an amazing prayer, and when you read it and dissect it, and you realize the powerful faith that he was exercising after confession to the sailors that he's the one, he's the cause of the storm, and he said, if you toss me overboard, I think you'll be okay, and he does, and that's really repentance when you're willing for that to happen. It's practical repentance.
Well, again, we won't have time for all the others, but we do have Habakkuk and Mary. But you have an epilogue, which I thought we might close with, and that is the purpose of prayer, because you really talk about how we should pray, what we can learn from some of these individuals. And so just in the few minutes we have left, what would you say to our listeners about why they should pray, the purpose of prayer, and anything that sometimes we might overlook when we are praying? Sure.
I think the most important part of prayer, we are in agreement, we're coming in agreement with God. Now, God knows, if you're coming for confession and you've sinned, and you say to God, I've sinned, Lord, and I'm so sorry, please forgive me. Now, God, do you think, doesn't know that you've sinned? He does. But when I come and agree with God, and I said, yes, I am guilty as charged, please forgive me, God said, you are forgiven, because positionally you've been forgiven eternally. But then on a daily basis, we'll come in, and that's why Jesus said, we forgive us as we forgive others. So as we forgive others, our daily failures are forgiven as we come to the Lord. But the second thing is, are we coming to him in declaring our utter dependence on God? That we cannot do it. We are not, we can try, but certainly we know deep down that there's so many things in our lives we are dependent on God, and God is the only one who can truly do great things in us and through us. And so in that declaration of dependence on God, we are actually saying, God, we are placing our trust in you because you and you alone can do great and mighty things. And therefore, you come to him with confidence, you come to him in trust, you come to him in surrender, and believing that he can do far exceedingly abundantly. We prayed for one of my daughters for 7 years about an issue, and then God really answered it in such a way we were just overwhelmed. And then when she was asking me, I said 2 words, exceedingly abundantly. We prayed for this matter and trusted God completely. We placed all of our trust in him, knowing that he alone can do this, and God did it exceedingly abundantly. So it is utter dependence on God. It's trust and surrender to God. And God delights in us when we do that. In fact, the Scripture said he rejoices over us with singing. And that's really an amazing thing. I remember in my own life when I started the church 31 years ago, running. Then I was on my back for 2 weeks, and I looked up, and God said, I can do this without you. You cannot do it without me. And I said, Lord, please forgive me. But, for 29 years, I've never given a breakfast appointment because the first fruit of the day belongs to the Lord. From that moment on, and the Lord began to bless and do things. I accomplished things in a day that I couldn't accomplish in a month. When I spend the first fruit of the day in praise and worship and adoration of the Lord. And so that's really what prayer and praise is all about.
Well, again, it's just an incredible book. And let me just mention, we also have a link to ltw.org, which, of course, stands for Leading the Way. And as you go there, there's a place where you can watch or listen, read a lot of different topics, of course, information about your global work and all sorts of other resources. So we've posted that on the website as well. Michael Youssef, it's always just a great opportunity to learn from you, and I hope that people will not only get a copy of this book and go through it individually, but I, again, alert some of our listeners out there that might be pastors or preachers or Bible study leaders or small group leaders. This would just be a great way to teach on prayer. And I think it's a great way to begin to not only learn about prayer, but also learn about some of the struggles of these ordinary people in the Old and New Testament that found themselves in circumstances where they needed to depend on the Lord. So thank you once again for joining us here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby Anderson. You are doing a huge service to the Christian community, and your media ministry is so powerful, and God is using it. Just be encouraged today.
Well, thank you so much. Let's take a break. And again, we have information about this book on the website, pointofview.net. We have a link, of course, to ltw.org, so you can find out a little bit more about Michael Youssef. And as you go there, of course, we have a way that you can order the book. And as you're there, of course, you'll also find some other resources, the Viewpoints commentary, some videos that we post for you, as well as some take action items. So I hope that you'll take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, I hope that some of you that appreciate the conversations we have here every single day might click on that button that says donate. And that will be a way for you to help us continue these programs. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. All that coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Last hour today, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about this new survey that has come out from Gallup poll, which indicates that a very high percentage, a majority of individuals that either identify as Democrats or leaning towards the Democratic Party actually embrace or positive about socialism. And so we'll talk about that for just a few minutes. And again, I might just mention, since we'll be talking about capitalism and socialism, one of the booklets that we've made available here at Point of View is a booklet I put together on capitalism and socialism. Of course, I also have a book on Christians and economics. So that's one resource that would be available to you. And again, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you'll see kind of a summary of that Gallup poll that came out on this issue. And it so happens that my commentary, which I always write a week ahead of time and record a week ahead of time today, is on the battle over socialism. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Then a little bit later this hour, I want to get into a couple of other cases relating to the Second Amendment. The decision to actually charge the individual in Tampa, Florida, who shot that individual at the Tampa Bay convenience store with manslaughter, because originally he was defended because it fit into the stand your ground law. We're going to get into that in some detail. And of course, the Ninth Circuit Court has, in a couple of weeks ago, talked about the fact that they upheld the Second Amendment rights by actually blocking California's confiscation of large capacity magazines, and even what you had in Hawaii, which was a ban on open carry. But then, as David French says in the second article we've posted on our website here, the Ninth Circuit Court returns to form, upholds a bizarre California gun regulation. So those are just a couple of issues we'll cover this hour. And at any point, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you go to the website today, my commentary is entitled The Battle Over Socialism. And what I was really doing was talking about how what sometimes were kind of outlier or maybe extreme positions, which are becoming more mainstream. And I say that we're in the midst of kind of a battle over socialism, and it's not really an academic debate about socialism. It isn't even a discussion about the impact of socialism, say in Venezuela or Cuba or something like that. But it's, in some respects, something that's happening right now during these midterm campaigns, as you have individuals who are self-proclaimed socialists, like Bernie Sanders in the United States Senate, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has won a primary in the House race and probably will be in the House of Representatives and would be one of two that I think I can identify as members of the Democratic Socialist Party. We'll get into that in just a minute. And so the talking points have been things like free college tuition, and then one we've talked about quite a bit here on Point of View, and that is the issue of Medicare for all. The argument that really we want to have a single-payer plan, we want government to take over health care, and that this is, of course, raising some really important questions. And as you find yourself as a voter right now, and you have various candidates talking about this, I suggest in the commentary some good questions to ask. One of those is, do we really want more government control of health care? If you, for example, have friends that are in the VA, or maybe you've served in the military and you've gone to the VA, do you think that's working very well for you? Or you might have people in Medicare. You know, maybe you've been in Medicare, or you know people that have. you said, this hasn't worked so well for them because unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. are making judgments about what's on the formulary. And your doctor says, well, you really need this particular drug, not the generic. And the policy says, yeah, but you're only going to get the generic because that's cheaper. Or maybe you are told that this particular surgery, this particular drug regimen is going to work best. And Medicare says, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to cover that. And so that's a big issue. And, of course, do we really believe that by forcing doctors and hospitals to accept less of a payment, the Medicare level payment, which is always lower than what you get from private health insurance, are some doctors going to say, I give up, I can't make this work, or hospitals simply give up? What would be the implications of that? And, of course, the biggest question is the question of cost, because as we've pointed out from the Mercatus study that came out, the estimates are that Medicare for All would cost an additional $32 trillion more than we have right now. To put that in perspective, we have a national debt of about $20 trillion. And the argument always comes back, well, we can raise taxes. Yeah, you'd have to double them. You'd have to double the corporate income tax. Then they also talk about cutting defense spending and implementing a carbon tax, and on and on and on. And so this is why when people look at this, they say, are we really sure that we want to move to a more socialist economy? And this is where the Gallup poll, I think, says that so far we have a majority of Democrats, 57% to be exact, according to Thomas Gallatin here, that actually favorably view socialism. This is the first time that number, that percentage, has increased to a majority. By contrast, most Republicans, or people that lean Republican, 71% have a favorable views of capitalism. And if you look at the original Gallup polls, you see that essentially the views that Republicans or people that lean Republican haven't really changed in terms of capitalism and socialism. Back in 2010, 72% positive about capitalism, 71% this time. Positive view of socialism, 17%, 16%. But the remarkable change has happened among Democrats, from a very small percentage to a very large percentage that have a positive view of socialism, which increases each year, and a decreasing a percentage of those who have a positive view of capitalism. Now, of course, you have to recognize with some disclaimers that even the Gallup poll suggests that it's possible that the drop in Democrats' positive view about capitalism is related to Donald Trump's presidency. And since he's seen as a capitalist, maybe because I dislike Donald Trump, I dislike capitalism. Some of it has to do, I suspect, also to the way the media portrays people that are capitalists. You know as well as I do, if you see a TV program or a movie program and it's something about capitalists, almost always you know it's going to be the bad guy. And then also they say that they didn't really define socialism or capitalism. And in my booklet on capitalism and socialism, and also on my book, Capitalism, or actually Christianity and Economics, I point out that sometimes the percentages change when you say, by capitalism, I mean a free exchange of ideas in a market economy where there's limited regulation from the government. Then the percentages go up a little bit. So it is possible. But nevertheless, I think also it is possible that in the Senate you have Bernie Sanders, a self-described socialist. In the House, maybe we will have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who actually defeated Joe Crowley in the June primary. And now in Michigan, you have Rashida Tlaib, who is another member of the Democratic Socialist of America, won in Michigan in a primary in August. And so it's possible that with having more people talking about socialism, maybe indeed socialism is something that is going to be more embraced by the Democratic Party. But nevertheless, Gallup poll surveys just came out today saying a lot more individuals support socialism than ever before. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We're in the midst of a battle over socialism. This isn't an academic debate about socialism. It isn't even a discussion about the impact of socialism on Venezuela. The battle over socialism is taking place in the midterm campaigns led in part by self-proclaimed socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Two of the key talking points have been free college tuition and Medicare for all. These are not just fringe topics only discussed by a few radical leftists, but are becoming mainstream in the Democratic Party. Now, let me hasten to add that not all Democrats embrace these ideas, but most of the Democrats who will be running as presidential candidates in less than 2 years do propose such ideas. Voters need to be asking these candidates some important questions. Do we really want more government involvement in health care? Perhaps the most important questions are cost. One recent study found that Medicare for all would increase federal spending by more than $32 trillion during the first 10 years. By the way, total federal spending during that same period is projected to be about $56 trillion. So a good question for these candidates might be, how can we afford an additional $32 trillion? Rarely are such questions asked, but when they are asked of candidates, you get suggestions like raising the corporate income tax, cutting defense spending, and implementing a carbon tax. Then another question comes to mind. Won't that completely destroy our growing economy and crush manufacturing and other industries? This election and the next will be awash in socialist slogans about free tuition and free health care. Responsible voters need to ask these candidates some important questions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for a few minutes, focus on the subject of the Second Amendment and a couple of the gun-related issues that have surfaced. And one of those is the shooter in Florida who was actually originally exonerated. And if you're not familiar with the case, and I suspect many of you are because we have discussed it before, but let's go through it just in case you're not familiar. You have Michael Drejka, who killed Marcus McLaughlin a month ago in a shooting, and it really had to do with this idea of your stand your ground self-defense law. He's been arrested and charged with manslaughter. Now, if you've ever watched the video, you kind of know the story, but let me try to go through it fairly quickly. And that is, you have Marcus McLaughlin pulls up into essentially a handicapped parking spot. This takes place in Tampa Bay. And he's going into a convenience store with his 5-year-old son. While he's inside buying some snacks, then you have his girlfriend, Brittany Jacobs, with 2 other children. And this is where Michael Drejka approaches the car and starts an argument with her about the parking spot. Now, we do know from previous experiences that he has always had an issue about people parking in any kind of handicapped spot. And we also now know, which I didn't know even when we covered this the first time, that he's even in the past drawn his gun. Okay, so already we've got a conflict developing. Okay, Marcus McLaughlin comes out and he sees the argument and he pushes Michael Drejka to the ground. At this point, maybe you've seen the video. Sometimes they cut it there because they don't want to show him what he does next. And that is he pulls a gun and shoots McLaughlin, who then kind of staggers back into the store, falls down and dies in front of his son. Now, the argument that was made at the time by the Pinellas County Sheriff was that we have your stand your ground law. And he said at the news conference that the law in the state of Florida today is that people have a right to stand their ground and have a right to defend themselves when they believe that there is harm. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before. I don't care if you are a NRA, National Rifle Association supporter, whether you're a Handgun Control of America supporter. I don't care if you're a Second Amendment supporter, a handgun supporter, a handgun control supporter, a gun control supporter, whatever. I think everybody pretty much agrees that this was not the proper interpretation of the law. David French, who I'm going to quote from a little bit later, even said that it was an inexcusably bad misstatement of the law. And, of course, as we well know, there has been a protest about the fact that here an individual who, again, maybe escalated it, and this is a lesson for all of us to learn. In the midst of some kind of confrontation, probably the best thing you can try to do is de-escalate. Yeah, it's easy for me to say, I'm sitting across a microphone here, when you see what could be seen as a threat to your girlfriend, maybe pushing somebody down seemed appropriate. But the bottom line is, if somebody pushes you down, maybe you have the right to push them back, but you don't have a right to shoot and kill them. Do you get the point? And I think everybody recognized that this was originally a miscarriage of justice. So one other issue that you want to address certainly is appropriate. And we'll open up the phones to get your comments in just a minute. But again, deadly force is authorized only, I would say, in the most extreme circumstances. And I love some of the comments that have been posted on this article. Not every punch, kick, push, shove, or fear of harm grants a person a right to pull a gun and shoot. It just gives him a right to respond. And, of course, the law has been maybe a little bit abused. And this is why I think, if nothing else, there may be a need for the Florida legislature to reevaluate some of this. There may be a need for a judge to reevaluate this as well. But if nothing else, I did want to give you a little bit of an update on that particular case out of Florida. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's get to the other one on the other state side of the country, and that's in California. And that has to do with the Ninth Circuit Court. And David French, who I just mentioned a minute ago, wrote this piece. It's the second article on our website today. And he said, well, we all knew it wouldn't last. Weeks after two different Ninth Circuit Court panels surprisingly upheld the Second Amendment rights by blocking California's confiscation of large capacity magazines and also Hawaii's ban on open carry, the nation's most progressive circuit returned to form. In a ruling earlier this month, he says it upheld one of the most bizarre, and I would agree with that, and nonsensical gun regulations in the country. It did so by essentially ignoring the plain language of the Heller decision, that's the one out of Washington, D.C., and approving a legal regime that will naturally and inevitably lead to diminished options for citizens who seek to lawfully exercise their constitutional right to self-defense. So, David French says, here are the basics, threefold. Number one, California's unsafe handgun law requires, first of all, that new guns have an indicator that shows when a round is loaded in the weapon's chamber. Now, to be fair, some handguns do provide that, but many do not. Number two, new guns must have a magazine detachment mechanism that prevents the gun from discharging when a magazine is not in it. I don't know of too many, if any, that do that, but nevertheless, that could be possibly reconstructed, but why is a good question there. The third one is just unbelievable. It requires, and this is a direct quote, requires new handguns to stamp microscopically the handgun's make, model, and serial number onto each fired shell casing, unquote. So, as David French says, the Unsafe Handgun Act is just as problematic as it sounds. First of all, there is, interestingly enough, the comment that came from the Ninth Circuit Court that said, according to the plaintiffs, and again, I'm quoting from the court, according to the plaintiffs, no handguns were available in the United States that met the micro-stamping requirement. The record does not indicate whether or how these figures have changed over time. So first of all, you got to think about this. What it would suggest is that anybody that has bought a handgun since this particular Unsafe Handgun Act was passed is technically illegal because no handgun has that provision. Most of them don't have any of the three. At best, maybe they have one of the three. And so that is the case. So how do they get around it? Well, California has, quote, grandfathered a list of makes and models of handguns exempted from the law. But if you look at the list, it doesn't include some of the most popular models in the United States. And, I love this one, gun makers must pay California a fee to keep their weapons in it. And so this is where the court even acknowledged that the number of those that were listed as grandfathered has been shrinking over time. And so David French makes this comment. Let's be clear. This law represents slow motion prohibition. He says, imagine if California passed an unsafe automobile act that said that new cars sold either had to come from a roster of models approved by the state only after their manufacturers paid a fee for it, or that these automobiles must be able to fly. He's using an extreme example to get the point. He said each year the approved roster shrank as car makers either discontinued models or refused to pay the fees, and each year car makers refused to design and build flying cars. Because, again, the Ninth Circuit Court acknowledged that no gun manufacturers right now are even considering trying to implement this micro-stampede technology, but they said it doesn't follow that that's infeasible. And then they go on to say that simply showing the number of handguns on the roster has decreased does not tell us much about whether the availability of handguns has declined in a way relevant to the Second Amendment. It's not the number of guns on the roster that matters, it's the impact on self-defense in the home. So we're going to come back and focus on this a little bit more, but what are your thoughts? We have put some issues on the table, capitalism and socialism. Also, the Stand Your Ground law in Florida, and now the most recent ruling in the Ninth Circuit Court, which upholds, in sort of a bizarre way, this Unsafe Handgun Act. And so what's kind of the future of this whole idea of Second Amendment and even the interpretation? And do we need to maybe to get first the legislatures and maybe even the courts to weigh in with some of these issues that are getting a little more complex? So if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to say, I need to read these for myself here. These are pretty intricate and even somewhat bizarre. We've posted all three of those articles, the one on the Stand Your Ground shooter, the one on the Ninth Circuit Court and guns, and the one on Democrats, socialism, and capitalism on the website, pointofview.net. Print them out, read them for yourself, pass them on to others, and get a conversation started. We'll start with our conversation with you right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's talk about law enforcement for just a minute. And Gary Bauer had some good things to say yesterday, so I thought I'd repeat a few of those. And he said, I was struck this weekend about how overt and comprehensive the attack on law enforcement has become. He said, for example, preseason NFL games started last week and the kneelers were out in force. And he said the media presents this as a battle between the NFL and President Trump, but he said it's really a battle between the kneelers and the police know it. He talks about the fact that the Broward County Police Benevolent Association is calling, interestingly enough, for a boycott of the Miami Dolphins after 3 players protested during the national anthem. He said last week 2 police officers were ambushed in New Jersey as they had been stopped at a red light. More than 36 law enforcement officers have been killed in the line of duty this year, which is a number I did not realize. But these athletes are still berating law enforcement. Then he goes on to say, of all the things affecting the black community, police are not the problem. According to the Washington Post database, 109 black men have been shot and killed by police so far in 2018, with the overwhelming majority being justified shootings. Compare that to 197 black men who have been homicide victims so far this year just in Chicago. And we talked about what has been happening in Chicago, how even the mayor, Rahm Emanuel, has been speaking out and saying, you know, this isn't a problem of the weather. It isn't the problem of joblessness. I mean, there are people that don't have jobs that weren't shooting other individuals. This is a problem of values, and we would certainly agree. Nevertheless, during a speech at historically black college, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren condemned the entire criminal justice system, calling it racist front to back. And of course, we've talked about that before. And then Gary Bauer goes on to say that after fierce criticism from law enforcement officials in Massachusetts, as well as Attorney General Jeff Sessions, Elizabeth Warren, who again, by the way, is running for the presidency, tried to walk back her remarks, saying she was not referring to individuals, just an entire system. I don't think it works very well, but nevertheless, that's her excuse. And it's just an illustration, again, of one of the issues here. And again, the most significant kind of recent cause is to look at another part of law enforcement, and that would be ICE, which stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And, of course, you've seen that. Matter of fact, I've got a commentary coming out next week on where the abolish ICE idea came from, how many people endorse it, and now what will happen if indeed Democrats control the House and Senate because of the legislation that's now being put forward and proposed to actually abolish the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. So the point he's making is that sometimes when we have these protests, they surface in all sorts of ways. NFL games, protests about the abolish ICE. But even this weekend, I did mention a little bit about these protests, which had just a few, really a handful, 24 at most, white supremacists or white nationalists. But the protest there was really the counter-protest. And as Gary Bauer says, the protest in Washington yesterday, which would be, of course, Sunday, because he was writing this yesterday, said a few dozen white nationalists came to the nation's capital to hold a demonstration, and they were met by thousands of members of Antifa and others. And again, these were individuals wearing black clothing, anarchists, that were supposedly there to demonstrate against the white nationalists. But he shows a video, which you can watch on your own, of those actually screaming at the D.C. police officers, who, by the way, are all, to a person on this one video, African-American. But nevertheless, Antifa members were heard chanting, "No borders, no walls, no USA at all." And other progressives gladly went on record talking about the idea that they wanted to kill President Trump. So again, we have these demonstrators wearing masks, and even again, sometimes those who are being assaulted are law enforcement. He also points out that some of the demonstrators actually attacked the NBC news crew. And just again, some more evidence of the fact that this particular group is no friend of the First Amendment. And he says the great irony here is that there are laws on the books in many states prohibiting the wearing of masks at demonstrations, and yet nevertheless, what do we see? They're allowed to do so. Some of those laws were passed, by the way, at the early part of the 20th century to combat the KKK, interestingly enough. But nevertheless, just some more examples of that. And then he ends with kind of a contrast. He said, last week I told you about the New York Times photographer who got upset seeing children at Trump rallies. But what people chant at rallies is very telling about what's in their hearts. If you go to a Trump rally, you hear USA, USA, USA. But if you go to some of these particular protests, you hear no borders, no walls, no West USA at all, or cops and Klan go hand in hand, and some of the other kinds of phrases. So if nothing else, just a reminder that when we talk about some of these issues, there is a tremendous protest and backlash right now against those in law enforcement. And let me add to one more issue. This comes from Matthew Bentley. Even sometimes the protests that are not well received by those people that have served in the military. Matthew Bentley, in his piece in Weekly Standard, says the NFL doesn't actually care about you or your service. And he says last year when the kneeling controversy erupted like a California wildfire and the president launched a series of attacks on the NFL and Colin Kaepernick, I argued that cooler heads should prevail and a middle ground could be reached by both sides. And I appreciate that. He said, like a recovering alcoholic I am, and I must have been in denial, hoping that, like a chronic gambler, that Roger Goodell would do the right thing or even just do his job. Well, Matthew Bentley says, obviously I was wrong, because here we are again, my friends, another year, another round of protest, and all because the NFL and Roger Goodell have been subverted by the most sinister of human endeavors, politics. He says, reader of my books have heard me say this before. I define politics as the absence of all morality and leadership in decision-making. Pretty skeptical there. It's undeniable. Want to destroy a career? Say something political the masses disagree with, and you can begin to see what happens to those individuals. As I wrote last year, I love the NFL. It is arguably the greatest pastime in the world. But I can no longer, he says, give my patronage to a business that takes me and those like me who served for granted, that use patriotism to sell merchandise, which I own plenty of, by the way, even though my Bengals have been a disappointment under the rudderless leadership of Marvin Lewis, though there's a different column, while claiming to be the standard bearer of the American flag. If the NFL truly believed in patriotism rather than proffer he uses a word I won't use here, solution to the kneeling controversy, the policy would have been handled the way the NBA and others have resolved it. Stand on the sideline, hands at your sides, over your heart, and be respectful. No hiding in the locker room, no walking on the field like Willie McGee as the anthem plays. But the NFL is not capable of effective leadership, he says, when addressing any issue. We've seen this time and time again in recent years with domestic violence, criminal behavior, and on-field rule controversies. It's not an accident that the NFL has a longer series of problems than any other American league. Leadership matters. There's a reason one of the first things I learned as a second lieutenant in the Marines was simple and direct. Make a decision, Lieutenant, right or wrong, just make a decision. But Roger Goodell, he says, obviously never learned that lesson. Instead, he tried to assuage both sides of the kneeling controversy, and what happened last Thursday was the result. Players kneeling, raising fists, taking leisurely strolls onto the field during the national anthem during the preseason games. At this point, he says it's not even about the protest or what we're protesting. I don't care what the injustice du jour is. It could be the mistreatment of magical unicorns on Fantasy Island. I personally feel and believe now, more than last year, that players should stand, period. End of story. You want to bring attention to an issue? Start a foundation on your own. Work within the NFL to improve conditions in the inner city. I would give 100% support to these endeavors, but don't protest at work. I can't do it. Neither should the players. The NFL players are at-will employees who can be terminated for any reason that is not illegal or discriminatory. As a result, the NFL could have easily resolved this issue. Instead, it allowed the situation to spiral out of control. And several of the players are taking advantage of it, like unruly teenagers testing the limits of weak-willed parents who don't have the intestinal fortitude to drop the hammer after the kids blow through their curfew. Well, he goes on to say some other things, but the point he's making is that there is past time, for the NFL to make some decisions. The fact that it did not tells us that we're going to have a lot more kneeling, maybe now even raised fists, and people leisurely walking on the field during the national anthem. I'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Jerry Boykin has never shied away from a fight. As the CEO of the Family Research Council today, Boykin regularly shares his opinions on a variety of issues from his religious perspective. But Boykin hasn't always been at FRC. A photo recently surfaced of Boykin from 1980. The black and white photo features a youthful Boykin, a major in the U.S. Army then, with dark hair and matching beard. He's addressing a group of about 100 Army Delta Force operators. The room is nondescript, cement walls covered with exposed wiring with but one decoration, a poster. And that's not just any poster. It's a collage of the pictures of the 100 Americans held hostage in Iran. Boykin's Delta Force was about to go rescue them, but Boykin and his men first paused to pray. Many might second-guess this decision. Some might suggest that it was even illegal for Boykin to use his authority to coerce his men into praying. Others might conclude that the act was little more than civil religion, a meaningless act with no more efficacy than if the operators had gathered together and yelled, "Go team!" But for the men about to dive into the face of death and danger, prayer is what they wanted and needed. Thankfully, though our service members sacrifice much in the cause of freedom, they do not give up their religious freedom. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just mention real quickly that there was another piece that I thought would be of interest to some of you, and it's by our friend Victor Davis Hanson, has been on in a while, but it's entitled The Deflation of the Academic Brand. And for some of you that have spent your time and energy and money to send your kids or grandkids to college, and then come back and say, I don't know that they learned a great deal, this is really a great piece for you as well. Now, in one of the pictures that's on the front of this article shows Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so she will bear some of the brunt here, and it goes back to something, if you were listening on Friday, Lathan Watts suggested that every time she speaks out and brags about the fact she has an economics degree, it kind of devalues the value of an economics degree because she doesn't seem to really understand some of the basic economic principles. And when, as best we can determine, she spent, or her family spent, or she ran up as loans $300,000, it was a really bad investment. But he starts with some of the others, and he says, you know, right now the argument against Donald Trump is we got a bunch of know-nothings in there. Donald Trump doesn't know a great deal. We've got really talented people that are possible foreign policy experts just sitting around at the Council of Foreign Relations waiting to be called. We have economists at Harvard in the economics department wondering when they're going to finally be put in positions of leadership. We have people that are part of the Brookings Institute that wonder why they aren't being used in one way or another. And so he goes through this long list, and I won't bore you with all of them, but he talks about Anthony Scaramucci's Harvard law degree didn't really seem to be a guarantee against some of the problems he had, or Bruce Orr's similar degree didn't ensure common sense, because he's been in the news right now. The Mueller team, along with a group of now disgraced, he says, reassigned and retired officers at the top echelons of the FBI, the dissent of ex-CIA head John Brennan, ex-Department Defense, I should say, Intelligence Chief James Clapper, and others just are an illustration. Sometimes when you have really smart people, they don't make smart decisions. So then, of course, he comes to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and just reminds us of some of the things that she said, and we can talk about some of her misunderstanding of economic principles. This coming from an individual that posted recently, how many other House Democrats have a degree in economics like I do? Wouldn't brag about it if you can't answer some basic economic questions. Of course, he talks about her appearance on firing line. We've talked about that before, not really having a very good understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, arguing that the reason the unemployment rate is so low is because everyone has two jobs, when actually only 5% of Americans at all could possibly be put into that category, and where even some of the liberal-leaning groups like Politico call it not just a lie, but pants on fire untruth. Then statements about the upper middle class doesn't exist anymore, assertions that Medicare and Obamacare have turned out to be so successful, and the way we'll pay for Medicare for all is to just, fiddle a little bit with the corporate income tax, fiddle a little bit with maybe decreasing defense spending and implementing a carbon tax without any kind of implication. But then he moves on to Sarah Jeong, who is an individual that, again, has a degree from the University of California at Berkeley, a Harvard law degree, and all the problems that we've had here and all the statements of comparing Trump to Hitler, the very horrible and critical things she said about people in law enforcement and the rest. And so before he's through, he also says, we even have people that are in office that don't seem to understand some basic understandings. He talks about a Harvard law graduate like President Obama that did not know that you pronounce the word corpsman instead of corpsman. That he thought Australians and Austrians spoke Austrian, and it goes through the whole long list. I mean, it's just quite a long list. He has one of Joe Biden, who's running again, who even said that George W. Bush should have addressed the nation on television the way Franklin Delano Roosevelt did after the stock market. That's so far off, it's hard to disconnect it all, but okay, let's work on it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not in office in 1929. Television was not introduced into the public until 1939, and first television broadcasts were not with the president anyway. And, you just go through this long list that he has here of individuals who have been oftentimes portrayed as our superiors. They've been to the better schools than we have. They're well educated. They travel in these various Washington, D.C., New York circles, and can tell us how we should be running our lives. And it's just a reminder of the fact that, if nothing else, we've had, as he points it, a deflation of the academic brand that has really begun to illustrate only so well why we should maybe be a little less arrogant about some of these college degrees, and maybe recognizing that common sense sometimes doesn't necessarily go with those degrees that are given out by these elite universities. So again, as we wind down today, let me just mention that my commentary for today has to do with the battle over socialism, and is certainly one of the topics that we have addressed today. If you'd like to know a little bit more about that, the first article that we have has to do with the Second Amendment issue of Stand Your Ground. The second one has to do with the Ninth Circuit Court and guns. And the third one has to do with the issue of socialism and capitalism. And once again, as we look at this latest Gallup poll, rather dramatic that a majority of Democrats, 57% to be exact, view socialism favorably, compared to only about 47% that view capitalism favorably. And we did see this coming years ago. I remember almost a decade ago, we began to see some surveys that showed that those under the age of 30, that would be the millennial generation, now it would be those under the age of 40, that at that time, about 30% thought that capitalism was superior to socialism. About 30% believed that socialism was superior to capitalism. And another 30% plus believed, if you will, that neither a particular economic system was superior, or that they didn't have an opinion, which means that about 2/3 could not say that the free enterprise system was a good thing, even though they were the beneficiaries of it. So, again, there's a lot of education that needs to take place. Let me, as we go to the end of the program today, mention that I do have a booklet on capitalism and socialism, which you could certainly get a copy of. My book on Christians and economics also addresses those issues. And I also have a booklet on the Second Amendment, which relates to the other topic that we've addressed this hour. So, again, some great resources that we would certainly like to make available to you. And, of course, we've posted these articles for you on the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to the interviews, again, that we've done, Michael Youssef was with us last hour on his book, Life-Changing Prayers. You can download that. Either watch it on our YouTube channel or listen to it again as a podcast. If you'd like to find some of the articles or even my commentary today on the battle of socialism, all available at the website, pointofview.net. And just before we say goodbye, let me also encourage you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. We are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you every day. And during the month of August, giving, as you might imagine, drops precipitously because, first of all, people have been gone for the summer. Maybe they're getting ready for school. They're not thinking about supporting this ministry. So your gift would be greatly appreciated. So if you can click on that button that says donate, a gift of any size would be appreciated. And we certainly appreciate you supporting this ministry, both in your financial giving and in your prayers. That's all we have for today. Tomorrow, our Millennial Roundtable discussion, all the way to Friday, our Weekend in the Scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective.